The Oscars this year, the biggest theme that runs across all 10 movies is either the concept of relational barriers that people are trying to break through relational barriers, or they're trying to set relational boundaries. And I'll get to the boundaries in a second, but the relational barriers, I don't know if you feel this way. So I'd love your perspective, but I think maybe this kind of smaller we, or, just being able to be in relationship with our neighbor may have a kind of COVID remnant associated with it. Like, I call it long-term social COVID effect is what I'm calling it, which is the idea that we still have these remnants of self-checkout and, there just feels like there's still plastic, shields, between me and other people. And then you add to that we dived into our phones as a means of rescue in COVID. And now when I go into public spaces, I just see a whole bunch of people just staring at their phones. And there's no sort of desire, I don't think, there's probably inner desire, but probably a hard sense of like, how do I break through that barrier? How do I break through that relational barrier? And it's just, there's sort of how do we do that? Because we spent so much time in social distancing and loving our neighbor in that way, which in itself is dissonance, right? That I'm loving my neighbor by being distant from you. And so I think right now, the call of these Oscars are how do we get back and break through these relational barriers? And so I'm wondering, was there any clues of that from the progressive era, or what's your thoughts on it? Do you think, like, I'm reading a book called The Power of Talking to Strangers, and just that being the solution is just be curious and talk to a stranger. and that's just simple to do, so what do you think about all of this? And was there any clues from the progressive era of how they, kind of broke through barriers?
Yeah. So lots of thoughts on this. So I'll try
Sorry, I
to be
threw the
brief.
kitchen sink at you.
But when you mentioned that is there a desire to be in a relationship or not? I actually think there's more than a desire. I think there is a longing to be in a relationship. But what's missing is not the desire. What's missing is the skill set, right? We were
Yes.
already struggling with that skill set before COVID already. And then we went into this 2-year period where we lost touch with that skill set entirely, right?
Yeah.
And so we forget that relationship is actually a skill. Like being able, like I'm sure that it talks about in this book that you're reading, Talking to Strangers, that it's actually kind of a skill. You have to deal with like the anxiety of it, and you have to think about
Yeah.
how
The
do I meet in a
embarrassment.
way that's not
Yeah.
awkward, and like there's all these hows
Yeah.
to do it, right? And that's actually, I think, what we've lost. I work in my church community with a group of young women who, they were in their early teens, their formative years when COVID hit, those years when they're first coming out as really social beings.
Yes.
And so that's an extreme case of like they missed those 2 formative years of building those skills. And so I'm working with them now, and it's like I see they sit in a room together, and they sit in a room together twice a week. And I see their longing to be in conversation and be in a relationship, but I see them also so struggling with how to do that.
Yes.
Um, and so I see this in myself. So my husband and I this year in 2023, we decided like we're just like we're gonna invite somebody over to our house for dinner every single Sunday.
That's
We're
good.
just doing this. And
Yeah.
I have
Yeah.
to say, it has shocked me how
Yeah.
painful and scary it has been. Like, I
Yeah.
have this massive, like, wave of social anxiety that comes
Yes.
over me, like, Saturday night and Sunday morning as I'm preparing for having these people in my home. And these are
Yes.
people that I know and like, right?
Right.
I just
Right.
wanna know them better, and I wanna spend more time with them, and I want them to be in my life in a real way, not just in a virtual way.
Yeah.
I just find, like, it's remembering, like, how to do this.
Yes. That's
That
so good.
is just awkward, and so I think that's a huge part of it, but and so when I look back to the progressive era, they didn't have this loss of a skill set, but what they had was the Industrial Revolution. So that
Oh,
meant that everybody had, millions of people had left small towns and moved off of farms and into these big, bustling, anonymous cities. So
ah,
all of the social structures that they were used to close, tight-knit families, strong neighbor connections, barn raisings and quilting bees and strong church communities, they just fell away. And all of a
Yeah.
sudden, particularly young men found themselves living alone in Chicago with not knowing anyone and not knowing how to construct a social life. And so there was a real push to invent new ways of bringing people together that worked for this world that they found
Yeah.
themselves. And so
Yeah.
the Rotary Club is a great example of this. Literally, it was a guy who had moved from rural New England to Chicago to become a lawyer. He was in his early 20s. His name was Paul Harris, and he just got there and he was so lonely. This life of living in rural America that he was used to was just gone. And so he said, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to invite 3 other professionals to just have lunch with me, and we're going to rotate. We'll have lunch at my office one week, and then we'll have lunch at his office next week. That's where the word Rotary comes from.
Okay.
Just
Didn't know
because
that.
he invented this, and it met such a need that it became viral. All of a sudden, there were Rotary clubs in every city in America. And as these men got together, they realized, well, this is meeting my need for social interaction. But now I also realize that I have the power to do something with these people. And so
Mhm.
it switched very deliberately from being a social club to being a service club. And now it's one of the largest service organizations in the world. And so what we find when we come together is that it feeds us and it meets our needs. But
Yeah.
then we discover all this latent power that we have to do stuff as groups, right?
Yeah.
And so the
Mm.
biggest thing that I think we need to focus on is nudging ourselves out of that space of fear and just into the fray of doing it and relearning how to be together.